Good morning. If you can just let me know in the chat that you can hear me okay, and we'll get going straight away. Good morning. Okay, let's get going straight away. So, today we're going to look at paper 2, and for those of you who had the exam questions, we'll go through them one by one, try to understand what we needed to do to get those answers spot on for the examiner. Any questions, let me know in the chat as you go along. Otherwise, listen intently. So the first question was, explain one reason why free trade policies are promoted by international economic organizations. And the strengths for this question were that candidates which explicitly referenced an international economic organization found it easier to articulate why they promoted free trade policies, whereas those who discussed the adoption of free trade policies in a more generic manner struggled to move past 2 marks. So the most important thing here is that you referenced an actual economic organization. So that may be, can you guys think of any examples? Let me know in the chat. What kind of international economic organizations may you refer to? Anyone? Any examples of international organizations? Yep, good. IMF taking down protectionist barriers in West Africa. Yep, that's a good one. WTO, another good one to talk about. Good. So remember, for these sort of questions, a minimum expectation at A level is that you have an example to give. All right. So make sure that you are consistently just underlining those keywords, writing some examples down before you start answering the question. Try to avoid waffling kind of explanations about things because that doesn't demonstrate your stronger knowledge and understanding of the topics. Right, question 2. Assess the extent to which global shift has caused more social costs than social benefits. So can you just very briefly just let me know in the chat in a couple of sentences what you think you may or may not need to talk about in this particular question? So what kind of costs do you think you may need to talk about? And what kind of social benefits do you think you may need to talk about? Let me know in the chat. Yeah, certainly unemployment is going to be an important one. You've got dereliction of buildings in Detroit. That's going to be an economic cost. How is that going to be a social cost? Something to consider there, Tom, right? So unemployment certainly is linked. cultural erosion, technological progress across the world, and loss of industry. Okay, so here, cultural erosion, I mean, to just expand on that a little bit more, that would be helpful. Poor working conditions in places where industries have shifted to. Very good. Yeah, so certainly talking about that. Any examples of that, James, that you could refer to in your answer? Okay, so you need to be careful here and not drift into economic costs because the question's asking about social costs. It's very important that, again, before you start writing your answer to this question, you take the time to consider what the difference between the two are. So here, most candidates competently who are competent about what they were writing, for the role of social costs and benefits. So, for example, to achieve an upper level 2 or level 3 answer, you needed to refer to the social costs and benefits in specific. So, the costs discussed could include things like impacts on health and well-being, as well as depopulation and increasing levels of crime in those particular areas. And the top level answers, those who are getting 9 marks and above, were often talking about how the global shift in itself has created winners and losers in different parts of the world. All right. So again, some of the examples that have been given in the chat here, Detroit certainly is a very good example that can be referred to, and you could talk about the social erosion, particularly high rates of crime within Detroit itself, have created a great degree of a lower quality of life. And then certainly, yeah, James, spot on. You've got Chinese workers banned from unionizing, so they can't get higher wages or even protest against very poor living and working conditions themselves. So avoid talking about the economic impacts. It's very, very easy to kind of default to that, particularly if you're going to talk about the Docklands and London as an example. So try to avoid talking about deindustrialization without talking about the social impacts that it's had. So health, well-being will be at the top of your kind of discussions, and obviously anything else that may then lead to something else. For example, crime may be a serious issue. So just be careful. It's a very easy way to kind of just fall into writing about things which are not relevant to the question. And you can see here the pitfalls. The question focused on social impacts. So whilst there were some overlaps with economic impacts, if you didn't address the social ones in significant detail, then you probably wouldn't have got into the top band at all. Right, next question. Assess the view that hard power is essential in achieving superpower status. So, let me have your thoughts, a very quick synopsis of what you think you need to write, or if you have written an answer for this, what you did write, just in a few lines, and then we'll discuss where we need to improve on this. Westwood Park Fan TV. Good question. I think this is kind of like on a boundary of things. So uh, I think more than anything, this would be useful to know how to make sure you structure good 12-mark answers. So the underlying things that you need to know for this question will be useful in other elements of your exam paper next week. Any thoughts, anyone, on this question? Just give you another 30 seconds. So just a couple of lines would be useful so we can have a little bit of a discussion rather than just talking about what went well and what didn't go so well. Good stuff, Joe. Thanks, Emily. So hard power involves military action. To be a superpower, you must use a mixture of both hard and soft power. Good. Let's have a look. Give you another few seconds, see if we can get a few more comments in before we carry on. Okay, so strengths. Candidates showed a good level of understanding of the factors that were involved in achieving superpower status. Candidates often did refer to figure 1 in their answer, but this was not required for the answer itself. So just be aware that if you are given a figure, unless if it specifically tells you to refer to a figure in the question itself, then you must refer to it. Okay, please don't avoid using the information that they give you, the resource booklet that they may give you in the exam, or the resource information that they give you in the exam. However, questions like this, where it just talks about assess the view without referring to specifically figure 1 or 2, you don't necessarily need to refer to it. So candidates used the evidence that they used was variable. So, for example, the best candidates in the United States use the United States as an example, where they can use both hard power as well as soft power, and this was often contrasted with the historical power of the British Empire and the emergence of recently of China. So, successful answers also came to a clear judgment on the role of hard power, and inevitably, this meant that you had to talk about other factors such as soft power in creation and the maintenance of superpower status. Certainly, the pitfalls for a lot of candidates would have been the fact that um, even though you demonstrated a good knowledge about hard power, you didn't really talk about in a coherent or well organized manner. So let's have a look at some more information just come in the chat. Yep, absolutely right, Tom. USA is the main superpower. Certainly should talk about that. Really good point, Emily, about the use of natural resources as well as economic power and location. Certainly that would play a very important role in the answering of this question. And yeah, James, spot on again with regards to the spread of culture and using that as soft power. Certainly, if you wrote your final paragraph about that, this would help you to end up in the top band sort of answers. Good stuff. Next question. So this is the shaping places topic, or regenerating places. I think there's 2 subsections. This is the regenerating places subsection. Although the questions are not very different to the other subsection in this particular topic. So study figure 2 in the resource booklet. suggests why urban places in less successful regions may suffer from a spiral of decline. So remember, as I said before, if it tells you to study something, then you must refer to it in your answer. Okay. So for those of you who have had a chance to have a look at this, and those of you who have not, have a quick look at the information, and in the chat box, just let me know what, just to summarize, what could be some key points that we could discuss. Please use the figure attached. Thanks, Tom. Any specific information that you might use to justify your point of view from the figure? Yep, cool. That's good. Anyone else want to chip in? What you might refer to or might use from the figure itself? Yeah, good analysis there, Emily. Only 20%, 27% of the population have higher education So that will have an impact on other parts in the UK. All right, let's go through this together then. Let's have a look at what went well and what could be done better. So the strengths were that candidates were required to suggest why urban places in less successful regions may suffer from spiral decline. And some of you, Tom, Emily, putting out some very salient points from it. The best responses applied to the spiral decline to a named example, for example, the Rust Belt in the United States, and use this to explain the process involved. And then some pitfalls. So majority of candidates did have an understanding of the concept of the spiral decline. However, very general statements without specific examples to support. So again, this is a 6-mark question. Remember, for A-level geography, if they are saying study figure 2, what it really means is use figure 2, but also try to indicate that you have a broader understanding by contextualizing a case study that you may have studied, such as the Rust Belt in the United States. Okay, next question. All right, so you've studied your local place and contrasting place. Explain the changes in the demographic characteristics of these places. So 6-mark question for this. Let's double check. This is that's the right one. So candidates required by the specification to know their chosen places in depth, and the best responses had a clear sense of place and were able to link the understanding to the question focus of demographic characteristics. Candidates in level 3 were able to discuss changes to the age structure and ethnic composition, for example, as well as the reasons for why this change may have taken place. So remember, demography refers to population, and if you're talking about population, that can be filtered down into many different aspects, 2 of which are mentioned here. So you've got age structure and ethnic composition. Again, be careful not to get caught out here. Very easy to kind of look at local and contrasting place and think, okay, great, this is going to be about regeneration or something. Be careful with these sort of questions that you underline what is specifically being required from you to answer this. So generally, weak candidates didn't really talk about demographic characteristics, and this obviously meant that as a consequence, they didn't perform very, very well. And the key thing here is that most candidates, when they see local contrasting place, they're going to think, great, I'm going to talk about regeneration or gentrification or something like that. But actually, that's not what the question is asking you. So just be aware of those little nuances. Okay, evaluate the reasons why regeneration strategies are often controversial. Right, so if you can punch out some examples of regeneration strategies that you may talk about in the chat box for me. And then very briefly write down one reason for why they might be controversial. So give me an example of one, and then one reason very briefly on why you think it might be controversial. Okay, Tom, so why is it controversial? Why is the Olympic Park controversial? Where's the controversy in that, Tom? Okay, so you got fracking, thanks Emily, and ground tremors. What's the controversy in that then? Okay, good, Tom. So yeah, displacing of many local residents. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, so let's expand that a little bit more. Joe, why is the increase in traffic controversial, and why is a loss of identity controversial? Okay, Emily, how would that affect people? What do you mean by affect those living in local area? What does it look like? What would it feel like? Okay, Tom. So where's the controversy in the destruction of historical identity? Who's going to be impacted by it? Why are they going to be upset by it? So you're all saying the right sorts of things here, and overall, generically speaking, these are absolutely the correct things to talk about. But you just need to get down a little bit further. And remember, for 20-mark questions in particular, you've got to talk about stakeholders. Who's going to be affected by this the most? Who's going to be affected by the least? Overall, you know, and balance of things, which is greater than the other, and why? Yeah, so you've got displacement of people, and you've given a fact and a figure involved in it, and again, talking about the fact that, yeah, absolutely right, Joe. You've got less social cohesion going on, and that could affect local people, but also impact access to local services and tensions rising between the locals and tourists themselves. Absolutely spot on. Okay, so interestingly, candidates who wrote this exam paper struggled to achieve the top marks at level 3, with very few reaching level 4. And candidates were required to evaluate the reasons why regeneration strategies are often controversial, as we've been discussing in the last couple of minutes. The best candidates showed an understanding of the idea of controversy and were able to discuss how this was shown through their chosen examples. So remember that you need to get down into the nitty-gritty. Talking generically about things is okay, but if you want to get top band marks, level 3, level 4 marks, then you need to kind of go into the stakeholders and talk about, what are the different reasons for the controversy arising. Certainly, with the Stratford example, if you're going to use that, Clay Lane's estate was completely wiped out, and they shipped off most people. They tried to house them in the local area, but there weren't enough homes, and a lot of other people were just shipped out to other places in the UK. So some ended up in Kent, some ended up in Manchester, some ended up in Birmingham, places they're not familiar with, breaking up families. There are examples of families where, grandmothers were left behind in East London, or they'd been moved to other parts in the UK, and then uh, leading to breaking up of families themselves, and then breaking up social cohesion. So there's the controversy that lies within, right? And they replaced it with these beautiful, lovely apartments, which most people in the local area couldn't afford to buy anyway. And so as a consequence, you had completely a change in the social structure of the area, um, in the last kind of 20 years or so. Well, since 2012, last 10 years. So a good approach, often reached level 3, was to contrast more or less controversial regeneration strategies. In this way, candidates were able to build towards a partially coherent conclusion. But level 4 answers had demonstrated an understanding of power and influence of different stakeholders and the role that this places in the level of controversy that surrounds a regeneration strategy. So again, remember, with stakeholders, you've got local players, you've got the local people who live there, the residents, but also you can talk about local council, you can talk about regional council, you can talk about local government or local national government even. And then businesses obviously will have a very different view about things in comparison to perhaps residents or even the government itself. Now, some pitfalls here. Level 1 answers tended to show isolated elements of geographical knowledge with generic sweeping statements discussing regeneration strategies. This often happens. Candidates will look at the world regeneration strategies and go, great, I'm just going to talk about everything that I know about Stratford or Docklands or whichever example that you end up using, without actually referring to the most important or crucial element of this question. And level 2 candidates tended to use case studies to outline contrasting regeneration strategies and whether they were positive or negative, without actually talking about the controversy involved. So remember, underline the keywords, highlight the keywords, try to break down what is it that the examiner's specifically looking for in this question. If you're thinking, great, this is really easy for me to write, then you might want to pause and reconsider very carefully before you start writing your answer. Often, I would say, majority of students who come out of an exam and they say that they've absolutely smashed it and it was really, really doable and found it really easy, often don't do very well. So it's because you might have seen the question in a different light to what the examiner is actually asking you to answer it in. Right, let's move on to global development and connections, the health, human rights and intervention. So this is a figure that was in this paper. Again, remember what we said about studying a figure. If they're asking you to study something, then you must refer to it, pull out data from it. So the key things they're going to be looking for are what's the lowest trend, what's the highest trend, and what's an anomaly, if there is one, within that data set. They may also, for earlier questions, ask you about whether this is actually an appropriate way to represent the data. You might want to consider that too, but in most cases it tends to be okay. So the question here is, suggest why some developing and emerging countries have had more success in reducing poverty than in others. So what I'd like you to do very quickly, 30 seconds, just quickly write down what kind of things you might talk about in this question. So how do you think, why do you think some countries have had more success? What could be some reasons for it? You can bullet point it, you don't have to write in sentences in the chat, and then we'll go through what the examiner had to say about this. So why might that be, Tom? Why is it that Southeast Asian countries have the lowest levels of people living below the poverty line? Maybe. I mean, Haiti is pretty in a situation in a very good agricultural belt. Um, Honduras, Kenya certainly. Yeah, Joe, low governance and planning infrastructure, that's going to be a good example to refer to. Anyone got thoughts about South Sudan? What's going on with South Sudan? Why is that so high? 80, is it 2%, something like that, of people living in below the national poverty line? What's going on there? Why is that so high? Okay, Ollie, yep. Those countries in Southeast Asia are going through industrial revolutions, so therefore that's creating jobs and employment, so people are able to fend for themselves. Tom, yeah, you're right. There is a conflict going on, and there recently was a civil war in South Sudan. James absolutely spot on. So what happened was South Sudan ceded from Sudan and became a separate entity, and then went into its own civil war in the last 2 years. So um, as a consequence, there's a lot of political instability in the area, and therefore a lot of people are not able to settle down and create an economy which will help them to reduce their levels of poverty. Yeah, good. Unrest, poor government finance. Not only poor government finance, there isn't actually really a functioning government or secure government in place. Good stuff. So let's have a look. So the reasons given for this answer, for the variation success, included access to education. So not many people talked about that in the chat over here. Poor governance certainly was talked about, and access to foreign direct investment. So some reference to it in the chat messages. So stronger candidates were able to apply their own knowledge and understanding and reasons for various variations in success in tackling poverty. And some of the things that you could have talked about were the Millennium Development Goals, certainly a very important thing to refer to in this answer. And we're able to consider whether these were applicable to the countries in the resource. Some pitfalls. Some candidates struggle to apply their own knowledge to the countries shown in the figure, and as such, did not tailor the reasons, so tended to stay in level number 2. So again, it was really good to know that some of you in this chat, identify the fact that there is a lot of civil unrest within South Sudan, and therefore lack of governance, lack of investment, leading to high levels of poverty in the area too. Certainly, wider geographical knowledge about or political knowledge would be very, very helpful for you to be able to answer this question very quickly and succinctly. If, however, they refer to some obscure country, which is unlikely in the exam, and you can see poverty rates being very, very high, you can apply your understanding from other places in the world and then write an answer for that. So in this case, if you didn't know anything about South Sudan, it's not really that important. What's important to demonstrate is that you understand that likelihood is that there's going to be a lack of government, lack of political stability. Maybe there might be civil unrest, there might be a civil war, maybe they're in a war with another country. Who knows? Those are things that you could refer to, and the examiner would be able to credit you for a broader understanding of the topic itself. Okay, so again, remember before you start answering the question, you might want to annotate the figure itself. Often, whenever I've picked up exam papers after a session's been done, very few candidates have actually written on the graphs or the charts that they've been given. So my advice to you would be, if you're looking at a graphic like this or a table, whatever it might be, get a highlighter pen out. If it's a table, for example, highlight the middle, lower, and highest values, and then maybe identify, just highlight or circle the anomaly that might be in that statistic that they're showing you. Okay. Remember, you can write on these papers as much as you like. Just make sure that you are getting that information down, so you don't have to then come back and go, oh, what was that? What was I thinking before that I need to put down? Okay, make your life easy. Annotate as soon as you see a trend. Annotate it. Just write it down very, very quickly on the figure itself, so that when you're writing your answer, you can actually refer to it, and obviously integrate your own knowledge along with it. Right, 20 marker. Evaluate the view that global differences in human rights inevitably result in geopolitical interventions. So, just some bullet points. What kind of things do you think you might want to talk about in this answer? And then we'll discuss what was actually required. So let's have a look at what your thoughts are. What kind of examples do you think you might need to use? What kind of keywords that you might need to use? So just punch them in, just bullet point them in, guys. So keywords, case studies, who may you refer to, who's going to be important to refer to in this answer, and generally, what do you think where do you think this answer should head? Okay, so yeah, you can use the example of Afghanistan. You can talk about Sharia law. Tom, absolutely spot on there. High and low levels of human rights. So, can you give me some examples of which countries you may refer to? Yeah, good, Joe. I think certainly you need to discuss that it's not as black and white. For 20 mark questions, you've got to know that it's a kind of a grey area. What's going on? How are some countries applying it and they're not applying it? Definitely need to talk about that in your answer. That will be what will help you to get a top band answer. James, human rights are often used reasons for why. Um, just gone off there. Yeah. So human rights are often used as reasons for why countries intervene, despite often having alternative motives. So, for example, Russia annexing Crimea, and then Russia using human rights of ethnic Russians as a reason to. Yeah, absolutely. I think is there any other country in the world that may have done that, James? Um, China versus India. Why, Joe? Why is that? Why is that a good one to use? Afghanistan versus United States. Okay, so why the United States? Is that the gold medal winner when it comes to human rights and intervention? Okay, yeah, Maya, absolutely. Certainly, no one's really intervened in North Korea. Um, who might you expect to intervene in North Korea? Certainly, China would be an example where human rights are certainly not applied. Do you know of any examples that you could use within China too? Okay, Tom. So, which country has the United States intervened with militarily because of human rights? That's an interesting one, Ollie. I think certainly you could talk about lockdown measures, but actually the lockdown measures in China are not very different to the lockdown measures in places like Germany, for example. So yeah, I think if you're going to talk about China's draconian measures, then you must talk about measures that have taken place in continental Europe for sure when it comes to COVID. And there are lots of other countries in the world that are in a very similar circumstance as them. Yeah, James, yeah, absolutely right about Uyghur Muslims. That's something that China could talk about. Yeah, so in all the things that you guys are saying in the chat are absolutely correct. I mean, talking about the controversial elements within the developing countries themselves. Um, but none of you actually saying what is the human right that's being abused, right? So can we just in the chat just let me know what are the human rights that you were referring to here? A right to life. Okay. Anything else? Hi there, guys. Sorry. So let's go. I don't know which part we got up to. I think I had my microphone muted there. I was talking away, and the microphone was on mute. All right, here we go. Let's start again. So, evaluate the view that global differences in human rights inevitably result in geopolitical intervention. So, the question expected candidates to evaluate the view that global differences in human rights inevitably result in geopolitical interventions. And level 3 answers began to consider why some countries engaged in human rights abuses were not subject to geopolitical interventions, while others were. Now, level 4 answers, particularly, evaluated why there was a variation in geopolitical interventions by considering the fact that some countries with human rights abuses had close relationships with the United States or held strategic importance or resource importance. So an example of that would be, for example, Saudi Arabia, right? So very few people here in the chat have talked about the role of Saudi Arabia. A lot of people have talked about Afghanistan being an abuser of human rights through the application of Sharia law, but no one actually mentioned Saudi Arabia, which is far worse. I mean, they have weekly executions without due process or trial. But again, you don't see the United States, turning up with their army. In fact, the United States has got bases across Saudi Arabia, but is a ally of Saudi Arabia itself. So that's something that you could use an example that actually, abuse of human rights doesn't actually result in geopolitical interventions, because ultimately it's all about the relationships those countries have with each other and whether they actually have strategic or resource value to those places. So the best responses would have considered those and would have talked about the role of the UDHR. For example, the United States is actively holding prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. It has for a very long time, and those prisoners have been held in a lot of cases without a trial, without evidence being presented to them. They can't even see the evidence that's being held against them. A lot of the evidence that has been brought has been redacted, and no one's allowed to know where that information came from. So that in itself is an example of human rights abuse that needs to be considered very, very carefully. You find that in recent years, Saudi Arabia had the head of the Human Rights Council. How can a country which has flagrantly abused human rights for decades and still carries out extreme punishments be considered a country that can head such an organization of the United Nations? So again, something for you to consider very, very carefully in your answers is that, yes, in certain circumstances, there might be human rights interventions, there might be political interventions, unlikely to be military interventions, but that needs to be carefully identified in your answer. And you can see here through the pitfalls, and level 2 answers tended to discuss a range of human rights abuses, which all of you guys have mentioned here. But the question is asking about the inevitability of it. Okay, and know that both developed countries and developing countries both abuse human rights, values, and the articles within that document, which I shared with you just shortly. You've got to got to remember, for the 20 markers, the examiner is trying to understand that that actually it's not black and white. It's not a right or wrong answer here. It's a grey area. There's some countries which are better at human rights than others, but others are, whilst they may convey the sense of that they are the promoters of liberty and justice, that actually they actively support governments, or in in a lot of circumstances have encouraged the creation of dictatorships in countries which are within their political strategic importance, right? So be aware of those nuances, be able to discuss them, think about them critically, and if you have written an answer which is not considering the nuances, then it's unlikely that you'll hit a top band answer for this. So just be mindful of that. Again, for these 20 markers, you've got to make sure that you have a broader understanding. And if you find yourself just going one direction in your answer, then there needs to be something that needs to be corrected very, very quickly. Now, remember, in the exam itself, before you start answering this question, you've got to underline the key words, underline some example, or write some annotations of examples that you refer to, and some just some information that can help you to structure better. All right, refrain from. I strongly advise you not in the first few sentences or in the first paragraph of your introduction, that is, to say that you largely agree or you completely agree with a statement. That is never a good start to your essay. So be careful to make sure that you carefully write about the case studies that you might refer to, or you might allude to the fact that actually it's a great area and these are the things that you'll consider in your answer. Okay. Leave the evaluative part to the end of each paragraph that you're writing so that you go back to the original question. So, for example, in one of your main paragraphs, you might say that it does inevitably lead to geopolitical interventions. That might be a paragraph that you might write about. And in that, you've written some examples and then you go back to the original question. In another paragraph, you might go against that idea. But then you tell the examiner at the end of the paragraph that actually, look, here, these are examples where this is certainly not happened, okay? And then come to a clear conclusion, evaluative conclusion at the end. And I've kind of harked on about this for a long time, so if it hasn't still got into your mind about this, then you must make sure that you use those words, because despite some but, okay, think carefully about how what you're writing is answering the question. Okay, if you find yourself going, yeah, I know this, I got this, I'm writing down everything that I know. If you're just plastering case study information down without actually considering what the question is actually asking you, then you're probably going to be limited to a level 2. Somehow you might be able to get into a low level 3. Okay, and we don't want that. We want you to hit the top band as consistently as possible. So remember to use case study material to demonstrate the point that you're trying to make. Don't just plaster key dates and information down. You've got to say, well, why is this valuable? Why is this relevant to this particular question itself? Okay, and obviously, as I've always said, write clearly and neatly in your exam. I know it's going to be a little bit tricky to do because of the time constraints that you have and the pressure of the exam environment. But to get around that, my suggestion would be, if you haven't already done this, then sit down, get an exam paper out, past paper out, and do the entire past paper. I know that there are some things, that elements have been removed, but actually just do a solid paper and do it under time conditions, right? No one's judging you on it. Just get it done, and then that way you'll prepare yourself well for the exam. So my suggestion would be either do it on this weekend, or certainly do it at least the day before if you can, unless you've got an exam, the day before. So do the exam paper. It will help you mentally prepare to be able to tackle these tough questions under time conditions. Okay, please don't hesitate to do it. It's one of the most valuable things that you will do that will help you to write well in the exam itself. Of course, good luck with your paper. You can leave questions in the chat, not the chat, the comments box in the video itself if you're watching this afterwards, or if you're watching it now and something wasn't answered. Actually, you could do that now if you want to put a question in the chat box while I'm still here. I will be doing a final prep for A-level geography paper 3 as well, and so watch out for that. I don't know if I've put a little placeholder for that on the videos, but I will do so in the near future. But for the time being, all I want you to do is focus on paper 2. All right, so get that done. I hope you guys all smash it out of the park. Thank you all for answering questions and contributing today. I hope it's been useful. And unless there are any further questions, I'll stay on for 30 seconds or so. I will bid you guys adieu. You're welcome. Welcome, Joe. Welcome, Tom. You're welcome, Maya and Emily. Thank you for participating, guys. Welcome, Tom. All right. Take care, Dylan. Good luck, guys.